This is M23, an armed rebel group gaining ground in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The rebel militia has captured the largest city in the east and is the major player in a coalition that wants to topple the government. The group says it's fighting to defend the rights of the Tutsi ethnic group. The Congolese government says they're the puppet army of its neighbour and enemy Rwanda, sent to plunder the country's wealth. While some in the DRC are celebrating M23's victories, many are suffering, with millions displaced in recent years as they flee the fighting. We're going to tell you what's happening in the DRC, what's really driving the conflict between M23 and the Congolese army, and how the outcome of the war could have implications for millions of people across the region. This is M23 and the battle for the DRC explained. The M23 group received a hero's welcome from some of the residents of Goma after seizing the city, and they've promised to keep fighting. Having taken Goma, close to the Rwandan border, their soldiers are now heading south to the city of Bukavu. The group claim their ultimate goal is to take the capital of the DRC, Kinshasa, some 1,600 miles away. M23 isn't a new militia, and this is a region which has seen brutal fighting for decades. In fact, the scenes in Goma today are reminiscent of 13 years ago, when shortly after M23 were formed, they first took control of the city, forcing tens of thousands to flee. Back then, they only held Goma for 10 days before the Congolese army forced them out. But since 2022, they've been taking more and more land in the eastern DRC, gradually isolating the city before making their move to seize it last month. That military success came despite the fact their fighting force is only estimated to be a few thousand. This small rebel group not only took the largest eastern city in the DRC, but it's continuing to make ground. But how? Well, although they officially deny it, the government of Rwanda is reportedly providing M23 with money, weapons and training. And according to the United Nations, thousands of Rwandan troops are fighting alongside the rebels. Why would Rwanda help a rebel militia? Because their government and M23 are formed by people from the Tutsi ethnic group. In order to understand the fighting in the DRC today, we have to talk about the Tutsis and another group, the Hutus. And we need to talk about this map of Africa, which roughly shows the historic distribution of ethnic groups across the continent. Compare that to this, a map of how the continent had been carved up by European imperial powers by 1914. At that point, around 90% of Africa was under European control. Today, the DRC is surrounded by 9 other countries, and ethnic communities still live on both sides of the borders. Since gaining independence from Belgium in 1960, this massive country, home to more than 250 ethnic groups, has struggled to build itself into a strong, cohesive state. It's seen leaders murdered, deposed, and has been scarred by numerous conflicts. Which brings us back to the Tutsis and the Hutus, 2 ethnic communities that have been in conflict for decades. The Tutsi ethnic community was slaughtered by a Hutu militia during the Rwandan genocide of 1994. Around 800,000 were murdered in just 100 days, the vast majority Tutsi. Following that atrocity, the Tutsis gained power in Rwanda and forced approximately 2 million Hutus to flee across the border to what was then called Zaire, but is now the DRC. The Tutsi government in Rwanda continued to view the Hutus as a threat, living just over the border. Rwanda staged 2 separate invasions of the DRC, with the fighting lasting from 1996 to 2003. Millions were killed in that conflict. But the fighting in the east of the DRC never really stopped, as Tutsi rebel groups continued to clash with the Congolese government. Eventually, in 2009, on March the 23rd, a peace deal was agreed by rebels and the Congolese government. One of the terms of the agreement was for Tutsis, including the rebels themselves, to be integrated into the Congolese army. But in 2012, 300 Tutsi soldiers believed that the deal had been broken. They deserted the Congolese army and formed a new rebel group, M23, named after the date the peace agreement was originally signed. And shortly afterwards, the rebel soldiers took Goma for the first time in 2012. M23 says it exists to protect the Tutsi community, and the Rwandan government has backed them because of that. But there's something else that might explain Rwanda's support and M23's desire to take control of the DRC. And it's what lies buried deep in the ground of the Congo. The DRC is home to huge mineral deposits. In fact, it has more than half of the known reserves of cobalt in the world, a crucial metal at the heart of the global green revolution, used for lithium-ion batteries which can be found in everything from smartphones to electric vehicles to national power grids. In 2022, the DRC exported $28.5 billion worth of goods, and the top 4 items it exported were all mineral deposits. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's also huge deposits of lithium, gold, diamonds, zinc, tin and coltan. And at the moment, the DRC is only mining a tiny fraction of the reported $25 trillion worth of untapped natural resources that it sits on. And that potential for huge sums of money is a major motivation for groups like M23. The DRC government has accused Rwanda of stealing its mineral wealth, claiming that it loses about $1 billion a year from theft, with minerals smuggled over the border. And the United Nations has said that Rwanda uses M23 as a way to extract minerals and export them for profit. And they also say M23 make close to $1 million a month by taxing the mines they control, helping them to pay their fighters and buy their weapons. With such huge riches at stake on both sides, it's a recipe for sustained conflict. But what does this all mean for the people living in the east of the DRC? It means a life that's never been at peace. More than 6 million have been killed since the mid-1990s, and the same number have been forced from their homes in just the last 4 years. In Goma, the United Nations has said the recent M23 assault saw around 3,000 killed and a similar number injured, with M23 forces using heavy weaponry. M23 strongly denies targeting civilians. The UN reported that hospitals and camps for displaced people have also been bombed. And there are individual cases of violence and devastation. As DRC authorities fled Goma, at this jail, prisoners started a fire and broke out, but some did not make it out. Women were burnt to death, their bodies barely recognizable to families. More broadly, sexual violence is a weapon used by both sides in this conflict. The UN has received reports of women being raped by the Congolese army and its allies in the region. And M23 has long been accused of similar human rights violations, with Human Rights Watch stating that the group leaves behind a growing trail of war crimes. Both the Congolese government and M23 deny accusations of human rights abuses. So what happens next? In Goma, M23 has appointed an administration to govern the population. And they're now the most powerful group in a larger coalition of anti-government movements called the AFC, whose leader, Corneille Nangaa, says he wants to topple the Congolese government. That would mean ousting Congolese President Felix Tshisekedi, who's desperately trying to drum up diplomatic and military support from other African nations. The DRC is calling for sanctions against Rwanda, M23's most significant backer. The country receives a lot of foreign aid, and if the international community puts enough pressure on President Paul Kagame, it's possible M23 would have to pull back. But for now, with Rwanda still backing M23 and the DRC refusing to negotiate, calling direct talks with the rebels a red line, the fighting continues. Because nothing in the DRC is simple. The biggest, most expensive UN peacekeeping mission in history has failed to keep a lid on the fighting. And remember that as the violence continues, this country will more than ever need humanitarian assistance. Last year, $910 million was provided by the United States, and President Trump has just paused all foreign aid. As African leaders meet to discuss the conflict, the fear is that this could turn into a wider regional war, with the horrors of the 1990s repeated. Leaders both on the continent and further away can try and deter the fighting, but right now, ending this decades-old war is seen as practically impossible. If you have any more questions about this incredibly complicated conflict and region, please make sure you post your comments below. And if you want to get more context behind some of the biggest news stories currently dominating the headlines, make sure you subscribe for more videos.